Welcome to Esports Atlas. This is the first part of the series called RNG in eSports, where I study different eSports titles and see how much the developers have added different types of RNG elements into their games. And to explain what RNG stands for, it is Random Number Generator, which essentially gives you examples. When you roll a dice, you will get a number through 1 to 6. Or when you play Texas Hold'em and you draw cards from the deck, or you pick a card from a poker deck, those things will be random. And everything that is not predictable and is determined by a random chance essentially is RNG. And on this first part, we will be going through MOBA titles. On the future, we'll be looking through FPS games, strategy games, card games, sports games, and all that type of stuff. And on this MOBA part especially, we have to use this special terminology. So I came with two concepts. So we have heavy RNG and we have light RNG. To explain what these are, heavy RNG are stuff like chance to stun, chance to critical strike, or chance to randomly spawn on a point X on the map, and etc. And on the light RNG, we especially have abilities like that are projectiles that randomly may bounce to a certain different targets, which are kind of like alternately may not bounce if there's not enough targets and stuff like that. So that is considered light RNG, and the other ones are heavy RNG. So essentially the light RNG is not that super thing that like changes the game a lot. And the heavy RNG is a thing that changes a lot in the game and can have a huge impact. But let's get started. So we're going to start this research with the biggest title on the market, and that is of course League of Legends. And we will be going through 3 different segments with each of the game, starting with Champions and Heroes RNG, then Item RNG, and lastly the game design type of RNG and the map RNG. And we're going to start with League of Legends Champions, of course, and we have currently 130 champions inside the game right now. And the golden question is, of course, how many of these champions' abilities and passives have RNG on them? And here are the results. So the roughly 11% of the total champion pool have RNG. But the key distinction that we have to make is, of course, is the fact that majority of these champions in this list have light RNG. So the ones that have yellow strokes on them are, of course, light RNG, and the reds are heavy RNG. So you have significantly less heavy RNG compared to light RNG. So in case of heavy, we have Kindred and Pard, who have these things that spawn around the map, which are totally random. I heard you can control somehow the Bard's spawns, but I'm not sure is that fixed or have they changed that. But then you have the light RNG like Katarina's Bouncing Blade, which kind of bounces randomly, and the same thing with Brand's ultimate that kind of bounces randomly. But there's also ways to control that if you have ignition on some of the targets. And now we're going to go through the item list now that we have gone through the champions. And this was really annoying thing to do because you had so many items on League of Legends. Not only had the jungle items, you had upgradable trinkets and augmentations to the boots, and I had to exclude some of the items from the list, and in process of that I might have excluded too many items. But one thing that I did right though is find all RNG items that were in Summoner's Rift. Of course, I've excluded also the Howling Abyss and Twisted Tree Line items because they are not played in esports, so I think that was a fair deal to do. And so we have around 8 critical strike items inside the game, and one item is of course Luden's Echo, which has the bouncing projectiles once it hits the main target, and I suppose that is RNG. I wasn't really able to find some testing data on that, how RNG is that. I know there's a radius how far they can go, but it seems to be RNG if you have multiple targets more than 3. And for the most part it is around 8% of the total item pool. It could be actually more or less if I hadn't excluded some of the items probably. But relatively I was surprised about these item results. I thought there was a lot more of it, but I guess because there's so many items there inside the game that it seems to be a kind of low number. And lastly, we are going to go through the actual map and the game design RNG on League of Legends. And this, again, I was really surprised because I remember back in the day, you used to have certain systems inside the game which were more RNG, like how the gold drops were from the minions that you killed were kind of RNG, but now it kind of scales with the minute and the level, and it makes more sense now. It's not RNG anymore. And then you had the dodge mechanic inside the game. So you have dodge runes. You had also abilities that gave you dodge, passive dodge, but those have been removed from the game. And only thing you're left with the map and systematic RNG is essentially two things. And one is critical strike runes, and these are applicable, I think, to all 4 slots. I tried to find numbers on internet or statistics to show how many of the people actually use these, and I didn't find very recent data. I found some data from season 3, and they were almost bottom list on each of the possible like runes. In the marks, the critical strike runes were on the bottom. They were the last, and to my knowledge, nobody used critical runes in the competitive play. At least I wasn't able to find any data regarding it, but still it exists inside the game, so it is counted as RNG. And the other thing that I was able to find is the Baron. So once you enter the Baron pit, it will, after 6 seconds in combat, it will cast a random ability. But once it casts the random ability, there will be a sequence which order it will go through casting the different abilities. So it will become systematic after the first go. But based on which ability comes first will determine the actual sequence of abilities that Baron will cast. So that is something that probably most people didn't know. And I thought they were totally random, but I just kind of guess I found out that it's totally, there's a system in place. And I tried also scuttle crabs, whatever they would have different type of a pathing on the path they move on the river, and I wasn't able to find anything, and it was totally coded, not RNG type of a path. And that kind of ends up our study on League of Legends RNG. Next up on the list we have Dota 2, which I kind of find a very interesting case of a study for 2 reasons. One being that it has existed in 2 different game engines, as in Dota 1 in Warcraft 3, and now it exists in Dota 2 in Valve's engine. But also the other part is that from its inception, it has multiple map creators on it, from Eel to Quinso to IceFrog, and now Valve and IceFrog. So the game has shifted a lot from its inception, essentially. And let's start with heroes, as we always do. Dota 2 has 111 heroes. And guess how many of those have RNG? The right answer is roughly around 25%, so 28 of them have RNG essentially. And this is quite a high number in my opinion, because that means every 4th hero will have RNG. And if we compare this picture, the one that we have on League of Legends, we can see one very key distinction. And that is Dota 2 has a lot more heavy RNG than light RNG on the game. So the amount of heavy RNG heroes is like 5 times over the ones that we have on light RNG. So that's quite a significant difference, while in League of Legends, the light RNG was the majority. And next up, we of course going to go through the items. And this seems to be a recurring theme on all MOBAs, where all of the higher tier items seem to have a bit more RNG than the lower tier items. So in Dota 2, in this picture, we can see the right side is the higher tier items and the left side is the consumables and lower tier items. So we can see most of the split is happening on right side. And most of the high tier items, and there's particularly 3 lower tier items that have RNG. But essentially, this is in totality, it is 15% of the total item pool is RNG. And it's quite high for items, I would say, based on the other data we have. And as a last part, of course, we have to talk about the Dota 2's map and the systematic RNG that exists on the game. And there's quite a lot of it. And where we would start, probably the gold RNG. So every neutral creep that you kill, every lane creep that you kill, and a lot of the summonable creatures will have a random gold reward. It doesn't mean that it's from 1 to 100 gold, but it's more like 80 to 90 to for example. So they will have somewhere around, it varies between each creep has their own gold role essentially. So some may have 50 to 55, some may have 30 to 31, and etc. So each of them have a different gold. But essentially, in the longer run, once you kill more creeps, it will play a pretty significant part in terms of your overall gold, and you can have a very different numbers between the player A and the player B because of this RNG. The next thing is, of course, the forest and aka the jungle creeps RNG abilities. For example, the Roshan has RNG stun on hits, so 50% chance to stun with auto attacks, and also it seems that there is some type of an RNG mechanism in which order his abilities will be casted, and this can apply to other creeps on the jungle which have some neutral abilities that have RNG, anywhere from critical strikes to chain lightnings. And as a third part of the map's RNG, we have the runes, and there's around 7 runes on the map, and 2 of them spawn on the river, and they will be RNG. However, if a rune of haste spawns, and on the next 2 minutes when the rune changes, it can't be another rune of haste. So it's not totally RNG. You can predict the next one. I mean, actually, you can exclude one option based on if you knew what was the previous rune. But essentially, there's a lot of RNG when it comes to the runes which will appear. On the next thing, which is the uphill RNG system. So when you are in higher ground and there's a ranged unit in the lower ground which are trying to shoot you up to the higher ground, there will be a 30% miss chance. So this is pretty significant in a lot of the staircase areas on the map, and can be very brutal and fearsome, not fearsome, but crucial to your results in that combat or trade or all-in situation, because if you're gonna miss a lot of hits based on your position, you might lose the fight. And that is a pretty big thing, 30% being on this. There's not that many of them inside the map, but significantly a lot, this higher ground system. And as a last part, essentially you have the damage RNG, which means this is kind of misleading from, I think the creators kind of made a misleading where you have the damage there, okay? It's set, they have a set damage which is shows in the score screen, but once you hover over your mouse over it, it will actually show you the real thing. So it's actually kind of similar to the gold one, so your damage can be anywhere from, let's say, 50 to 55, but will it show you the numbers between there on the interface? So it says like 52 or 53 because it will show the middle number, but that doesn't mean that you will hit 52. You can hit 50, then you hit 55, then you hit 54, then you hit 54 again, then you hit 52. So essentially there's a huge amount of RNG on the map design, and a lot of the game mentions and the items in Dota 2 on its overall. There's like a lot of things which you can't escape from. RNG is bound to happen in this game. There's no way to avoid it, essentially, because the damage thing happens on the neutral creeps, on the lane creeps. It also happens on the towers. It also happens on the heroes. So there's a bunch of RNG on the map itself. But that's for Dota 2 for the most part. Now that the Dota 2 part of the video is done, this is the perfect segue to Heroes of Newerth, aka Han. And those who know, Han pretty much like copy-pasted Dota 1 to a new engine. They took like 50 heroes, pretty much all the items, and after a while Icefrog says like you can't take any more, and then they started doing their own ideas. But let's see how much of those original ideas still exist today in the game. And first of all, we have the heroes. So there's 130 of them in Han. Funnily enough, the same amount in League of Legends. And as we can see, there's roughly around 17% of the heroes having RNG on them. Mostly heavy RNG like in Dota 2. But there's like 5 light RNG characters. But overall, like we're almost talking almost 10% less RNG than in Dota 2. And I started to like look why is that. And a lot of the characters like such as Tiny in Dota 2, they changed their RNG abilities and made them more skill based, or made them like proc every 3rd attack or 4th attack, that type of a setting. So they eliminated a lot of those RNG elements on those existing Dota 2 heroes, and just like made them non-RNG. And most of the RNG that exists on the current roster are still like, for the most part, they are the Dota 2 designs. And then we have, of course, the items. And I thought the items would be just copy paste from Dota 2, but they really weren't. And there's a really low amount of like RNG items in Han, and that is 10 out of 143 items, which equals to roughly around 7% of the items have RNG. And that is only like 9 items or so, and that is a very low amount of items overall, and this is like almost no RNG whatsoever. And I won't be going through the actual like map changes and stuff that exists in Han, because it is pretty much the same in Dota 2. They have very similarities, just Han has a bit more down stuff for those. So we just will be skipping forward to the next game. As for our next esports title, we have SMITE, what is made by Hi-Rez. And Hi-Rez always tried to make SMITE a very skill-based game. I mean, they didn't adapt out of the MOBAs by adding like these point-and-click target spells. Essentially, they made a lot of the abilities skill shots, so everything is pretty skill-based in terms of targeting your abilities. But what comes to the gods and to the items inside the game? So, as for gods, we have 73 of them inside the game. And out of those 73, 9 of them have RNG on their kits. And somewhere a bit over half have essentially heavy RNG, and rest are light RNG. And it's a pretty good ratio. I mean, this is a very low number. I mean, over totality, it's 8% roughly. And what comes to the items, you say, is they have a lot of items in this game. This heavily has most items out of all MOBAs that I've done on this research. So you have 183 items, which out of 12 are RNG, so that equals to 6.5% of total items are RNG. And looking at these numbers, I mean, these are pretty low. These are actually pretty one of the lowest on the overall statistics in terms of heroes and items. And what comes to the map, there doesn't seem to be anything that's RNG on the map itself. Some people suggested that the Titan might be having some RNG abilities, some type of RNG sequence. I wasn't able to find data to that point, so I can't really claim is it RNG or not. But that's pretty much for this SMITE. I don't think there's anything I need to cover from it anymore. As our final esports study piece, we have Heroes of the Storm, which is a game that kind of has gotten a controversial and mixed feedback about their gameplay design choices, whatever it's hero leveling and other like objectives and last hitting and etc. But let's talk about the RNG stuff on Heroes of the Storm. So first we have heroes. Okay, since by the way there's no items in the game, so we won't be looking at that section at all. And on the heroes, I was not able to find any heavy RNG. So it was pretty much like only few cases of light RNG, and we're talking about 1 to 3 cases. And that equates to 46% of the total champion pool in this game, which is 50 characters right now. And that is pretty low. That is almost, since it's light RNG, it almost doesn't matter at all. So it's non-existent almost. But, however, in the map pool, you had a bunch of RNG, however. So you can always put the RNG stuff into certain elements. And in some cases, I kind of respect the idea, let's put it in the maps instead of the characters and items. So in this case, we have 10 maps in Heroes of the Storm. One is only playable through customs, which is the Dead Mines or whatever. I'm not sure is that actually in the esports map pool. I don't know at all. But what I do know is 70% out of those 10 maps, so 7 out of 10 maps, are RNG in terms of, because these maps have objectives essentially, so you have point A and B, which you need to capture. But you only can capture them when they open. And in which order they open is totally random. So 7 out of these maps, or 7 out of 9 actually, out of the maps have this type of an RNG feature. So it's all about like being in the right place at the right moment and hoping that it will be coming to the point A instead of point B. But essentially, Heroes of the Storm is almost RNG free from certain standpoint. It's really how how much does it really affect? I'm not really like that. I don't have enough like playing hours to tell you how much it actually really means, that where the RNG will go in terms of the capturing points in your storm, and how big of an effect will it have actually on the longer run of the game. So it's hard to say, but from the other parts of the game, it seems very skill based in that how. As our last segment of the video, we will be looking at the actual RNG results, and I made this table having the highest RNG titles on the top and the lowest RNG titles on the bottom. And looking at these statistics, we can make few conclusions. Of course, I added 2 additional games, which you can probably see, Vainglory and Bloodlight Champions. I just didn't have time to make their own segments on the video, so I just added them on the table because it's easier to have more statistics so you can compare more of stuff. But Bloodline Champions essentially is like a MOBA hybrid, and the cool thing about that game was it was pure skill. There was no RNG elements on it whatsoever, so it's 0%. Then we have Vainglory, which will actually go below SMITE in a patch or 2 once they add more heroes, because that game only has like 24 heroes and only 2 of them had RNG, so essentially it has less RNG than SMITE. And so there's a few conclusions that I made from these statistics doing this research. One being about Dota 2. Sure, I think we can already look at the statistics and say a lot of the game is RNG. We can say 1/4 or even 1/3 of the game is RNG. They're so heavily reliant on a lot of the RNG events that happen on the game that you could say that I don't think it would be like very unreasonable to say 1/3 or 1/4 of the game is RNG. And that is kind of against what a lot of the Dota elitists say, whereas they make the pitch as our game is very skill based, League of Legends players can play our game, it's super hard. But then you look at the statistics and it shows that Dota is not really the hardest game, is it? Because Han essentially is the Dota 2 with less RNG. I mean, the game's design choices are pretty much the same. So that would make that Han would be the hardest MOBA on the market, right? I mean, that's everybody's opinion. Whatever you make out of statistics is your opinion, but that's my take on it. The other take on it that I did from these statistics is that it seems like, I'll make an analogy, somebody write this on my YouTube video, another YouTube video on my other channel, where he said there's a reason why people are likely to play Monopoly over chess, because Monopoly has RNG on it and chess doesn't have any, or it doesn't, kind of has the turn thing, but essentially people will play the higher RNG games. And we can look from the statistics, like Bloodline Champions never had like really big eSports numbers, did they? But that's why it's on the bottom in terms of viewers, because it didn't have RNG, so casuals couldn't get access to that game. Well, I mean, casuals can get access to that game, but they won't be having fun time if they're not good at the game. And Heroes of the Storm tried to fix that with their like group leveling system, but I think the real key is RNG, because Heroes of the Storm doesn't really have that good numbers either. It has lower numbers than SMITE, and SMITE has higher RNG than Heroes of the Storm, so could that be a reason why SMITE has higher numbers? And of course, in that analogy also, you would make the Dota 2 would have the highest numbers on watching viewers than League of Legends, and they kind of do in terms of from how much of the player base is converted as a viewer. But then again, like, there's a reason why the RNG affects the viewership, because it affects the player base, and I think that would be a very like a smart thing to say. I mean, Dota 2 is still the second biggest MOBA or action RTS on the market in terms of viewership, so there's a correlation between the RNG and the viewership on specific games, and you will be seeing that on the future videos on the next parts, because there will be a lot more evidence that supports this theory. But hopefully this video was very enjoyable for you, and you consider watching the next episode, which will be probably about strategy games, and then will be FPS, and then will be probably a 4th episode about other games. But subscribe, like, share, and thanks for watching. Cheers.